Premier League. Football fans want to hear this sort of thing.
But very soon, the honeymoon...
Groups of people over a long period of time, so there was not a good relationship with the local council. The local paper, the reporters and photographers were banned from Capello because of some of the things that they wrote. Again, Mr Scott didn't like these.
Roger Graham is the sports editor for the Greenock Telegraph. He was one of the members of the press whom Hugh Scott had banned from Capello, Morton Stadium.
We ran a story about the concerns of a hotelier in Arden who claimed that he had not been paid for a pre-season visit of Morton under Hugh Scott. And when the story appeared in the paper, we were subsequently banned. The relationship generally deteriorated dramatically after that.
But the local paper continued to follow the goings-on at Morton under Scott's chairmanship.
He came out and said that he threatened to close Morton as the shipyards had been closed. And it was said at that time that he had become less popular in Inverclyde than Margaret Thatcher, and that takes some doing.
In February 2000, a loan of £200,000 was given to the club from the Scottish Football Trust. It was solely to help renovate Capello's North Stand, nicknamed the Cowshed, which was unusable. But by the time Scott eventually called in the receivers at the end of that year, the Cowshed was still subject to a council prohibition notice. Morton fans were still forced to watch their favourite stand crumble from other areas of the ground. This is how it looks today.
Basically, the Greenock public would like to know exactly on what that money was spent, because as far as I'm aware, there were just a few bucket seats put into the main stand. There was a new roof put over the enclosure, which is known locally as the Cowshed, but I believe that insurance money paid for at least some of that, and I think people would very much like to know where that money and on what it was spent.
In a statement to Frontline Scotland, Mr Scott said the club negotiated a £200,000 football trust loan towards the removal of asbestos from the roof of the North Stand Cowshed at Capello Park. The £200,000 was utilised to remove the asbestos in terms of the loan obligation with the football trust. The rebuilding of the Cowshed was not part of the trust contract, nor would £200,000 have been sufficient to rebuild a 4,000-seated stand. At the time, the club was still owned by Hugh Scott, but he had been trying to sell it.
In the summer of the year 2000, Hugh Scott finally declared that he wished to sell the club, and he arranged a purchase agreement with Mike Peden, a Birmingham-based property developer. According to Hugh Scott, only he and his then chief executive, George Carson, were entitled to do financial deals on behalf of the club. But it would appear that Mike Peden actually did at least 2 or 3 financial deals, one of which was a shirt sponsorship deal with a Canadian firm called Prime Play, which Mike Peden himself announced at a meeting with supporters was worth £40,000.
Another deal which caused the fans some concern was the transfer of striker Andy Brownrigg. He'd been approached by Greenock Morton, who wanted to sign him for £25,000. The contract was signed by Mike Peden. Brownrigg arrived at Morton and played for 3 months, but he claims he only ever received 1 wage cheque. He later discovered the tax on it hadn't been paid. Neither was the rent on his flat, which Peden had agreed the club would pay. Mike Peden signed it on behalf of Paragon, his own company. Yet at the top of the contract it states clearly, Paragon Greenock Morton Football Club, new owners. According to the Scottish Football League regulations, for a person to sign a contract on behalf of a club, they must be an authorised official. Yet Frontline Scotland has learned that Michael Peden was never an authorised official for Greenock Morton Football Club. Since he was neither a director or an employee, he should never have signed any deals for the club, and neither should the club have allowed him. The chairman, Hugh Scott, has told us in another statement he had no knowledge of any £40,000 deal being concluded, and neither did he have any knowledge of the whole Andy Brownrigg transfer deal. In fact, when he did learn of them, he reported the matters to the relevant football authorities and the club solicitors.
We didn't know during this time if Hugh Scott was making decisions, if Mike Peden was making the decisions. We didn't know. think now, looking back, they were both making decisions. I think the thing was an absolute shambles.
When Morton finally went into receivership, a number of creditors were surprised to hear that in fact Mike Peden was nothing to do with the club, that Hugh Scott had been the man in charge all along. Andy Blair, a former Scotland under-21s player, was one of them. He says he's still owed £3,000 for a shirt deal negotiated by Peden.
All along I thought he was running the football club, and I was under the impression that he was trying to buy the football club from Hugh Scott, and that was in fact acting chairman until the whole deal was complete. I'd seen the plans for the progression of the football club, and it all fitted into place for me. I invoiced the football club for £3,000 worth of product, all at cost price, which I thought was doing them a great turn.
But he never got paid. Satish Patel is a local businessman who rented one of his premises to Greenock Morton. He's still owed money.
And it's only when Hugh Scott come and took over, this is when I started having problems with the rent. You would invoice him for rent, money wouldn't get sent, you had to phone up, you'd phone his house, you'd phone the office, speak to my accountant, speak to this, speak to that. You'd never get your money. Eventually the money did come through bit by bit at a time, but it's still owing me money at this time.
The whole experience left a bitter taste in the mouths of those who had bought Scott's dream.
Well, the final nail in the coffin was that he had lost entirely the support of his customer base, the fans. When they refused to turn out, when they voted with their feet and organised boycotts, then there was no future for Hugh Scott with Morton Football Club.
In January 2001, the receivers were finally called in. The club, under Hugh Scott's ownership, now had debts of around £500,000. It could no longer afford to pay in full the players their wages. The fans were furious, demanding to know what had happened to their club, and more importantly, who was responsible. An administrator was appointed to run the club. We asked him about some of the deals.
There is a question mark over who effectively was running the club for a period during the year 2000.
Well, you've seen the books. Who was running the club?
In respect of the individuals, there was a handover around about the spring of 2000, when Michael Peden was in for a period of time. But as I say, I think there is a question mark over who effectively had control throughout the whole of the year 2000. What you did have was Michael Peden, who to the press or to the outside world had said he had purchased the club, when in fact that was not the case.
We understand that there was a sponsorship deal from a Canadian company called Prime Play, reputedly worth around £40,000. Were you aware of this deal?
We've looked at the deal, so we were aware of it. It's one of a number of issues or investigation issues that we are carrying out. Now I understand that this issue and a number of others the fans may be concerned about. All I can say is that this issue, a number of other issues, we have looked at.
So you can't answer what happened to an interest-free loan which was given to Greenock Morton by the Football Trust?
I can say that Football Trust monies were received, and I can say that we have investigated how that money was spent, but I can't go further than that because again that is part of our investigation and part of our report to the DTI.
When we contacted Mike Peden, he said our version of his involvement with the club was factually inaccurate. He said the £40,000 was never paid by Prime Play because the deal depended on him becoming owner of the club. His lawyer added in a statement to us that his client couldn't make any comment as to any of the paperwork dealt with by the club. A consortium eventually bought out Hugh Scott. The club's still sitting at the bottom of the second division, but the fans are optimistic that things will improve, yet they'd learned a bitter lesson.
I think many clubs are so desperate for finance that they'll take money from anybody. Anybody who comes in with anything looks like a white knight on a charger to a lot of the clubs. And they don't ask too much where the money's coming from, what the strings are around it and all the rest of it. And many people are simply buying into clubs for property development deals and all the rest of it. It is that desperation of the clubs which makes them open up to all kinds of people to coming in. The danger is that they shoot themselves in the foot because there's no financial checks on this really. I mean, a lot of other European nations do carry out financial checks on clubs, financial checks on investors. You just can't go into Germany and sort of say, I've taken over this club. There's controls on you. Here, if anybody turns up with a bundle of money, it looks a good deal. So who's going to question it too closely?